Okay, so I think we are live on Facebook, and so good morning to everyone, and thanks for joining us for our Q&A session. As you know, at 11:30-ish, we usually try and do our daily Corona briefing, and we want to occasionally try and mix it up and also take questions from the public. So, as you know, we've been having telephone town halls every 10 days or so. And we also have done a couple of Facebook digital sessions, but it's been a while, so we're going to do one today. And basically, we have a bunch of questions already in the queue. We'll try and take some real time, but we're just going to try and take questions from everyday Burqueños on all these topics. And so here to help us with that is Alicia Manzano, also with the city. And so I think we'll just try and do as much as we have time for. Go ahead, Alicia.
Thanks, Mayor. So if you do have a question that you have for the mayor, please go ahead and write it into the comments, and we'll answer as many as possible because we'll go to some live questions as well. So let's just start it off with Francis. Why are we opening up when positive cases are still being reported?
So it's a great question, Francis. And the reality is, let's remember where we're at. We're in the preparation phase. So as of now, we're not really opening up. I mean, the minor exception has really just been golf courses and curbside businesses. So we're not right now, and we're watching the numbers. So we've been given some guidance that we might know in mid-May, so that would be, maybe the end of next week, on whether or not we'll be able to open up more or not. And actually, like you, we've seen that cases haven't really dropped off much. So, I think things aren't looking super good for opening up very soon. So again, it's just a decision that we kind of revisit every few weeks, and the next time we'll look at it will be next week. And we'll see then if we think statistically and health-wise we're ready to go into that phase one, or if we're going to have to wait a little longer.
Thanks, Mayor. So as you know, we get some questions that are very similar, so we're going to group this one together. It's from Gillum and Ken. Why is the city continuing to clear encampments, even though the CDC has advised against that?
So this is a question that I know a lot of folks have asked as well, in addition to Gillum and Ken. And want to remind everyone that the CDC guidance is for all of America, right, for every city in America. And in general, that guidance makes sense. But there are a lot of examples that we've articulated and that we've worked with our health professionals on. And it basically is like this. That guidance is for folks where there's nowhere better for those homeless folks to go, both for their health and for dealing with homelessness. And we're fortunate that in Albuquerque we have lots of good alternatives, including health care for the homeless, including our West Side shelter. And so we even have screening, and we have since the beginning, at our West Side shelter. So we know that people are much healthier in our system as opposed to being out on the street. And that makes total sense, I think, if you look at those two things together. That CDC guidance was really meant for cities where there was no better alternative. And so here we have lots of better alternatives. So that CDC guidance just really, we can do something better. That's what's good about where we're at with Albuquerque.
Great. So next question comes from Nancy. And it's about opening up retailers. Why don't we open all retailers with the same rules as big box stores?
So this is something I really wish we could do, and I would love to do it in this notion that, it is terrible that we've got these big chains open and then small businesses can't, right? That's something that actually no one, I think no elected official or local person wants to see and supports. The issue is really basic. Some of those big chains have things like food, and all food is available. And so that's why they're available. Or they have things, necessary home improvement items, for example. This is why your Home Depots and Lowe's are open, and your True Values. And unfortunately, we just don't have that many local businesses that actually offer that same kind of stuff. So I think we did alleviate the concerns around nurseries. So now all nurseries are open in varying degrees. Some can do curbside delivery, et cetera, depending on how big they are. So I think we've worked on it, but it's just a function of the fact that for better or worse, right, big boxes are providing essential services. So it was never about whether they're a corporate chain or not. It just happens that a lot of corporate chains like Walmart sell groceries. And so that's how we got there. But again, that all should disappear as soon as we get to that phase 1 of opening. And again, we're not sure if that's going to be in the end of May or if it's going to be June. But the guidance given from the state is that 20 to 50% of all retailers will be open. And so hopefully that distinction will disappear soon. And I can't wait to make it disappear, but the virus kind of picks when we get to do that. And so stay tuned. But in the next few weeks, I hope that distinction will disappear.
Now, Mayor, I thought it'd be fun to go to a live question. We just got a live question from Miguel. What is the reason for holding these daily briefings that you hold?
Oh, thanks, Miguel. Well, we got so many questions at City Hall, both from 311 and in the mayor's office, and from the media, that, it just became like we were spending all day just answering questions. So we decided actually that it would be better if we just said, okay, at one time period every day, we're going to answer all the questions to date, and then we're going to talk about what we're doing. And so it was really actually an efficiency exercise for us. And it's something actually that does take a lot of work on my part and on our wonderful communications team that Alicia is a part of. So for us, it is actually a lot of work, but it saves a ton of time for the rest of the city. I think the other aspect is there have been times when we need to get information to the public right away, whether it's about what's open and what's closed and what the regulations are and that kind of thing. And so we wanted to have it predictable so that, again, instead of everyone asking us at 8 o'clock at night what's going to happen tomorrow, we just say, we'll see you tomorrow at 11:30. And that also gives our staff, our environmental health professionals, our doctors, et cetera, it gives us a chance to get answers to those questions. And so I think in many ways it brings clarity and it also brings definitive decision making instead of just one-off answers throughout the day.
And I just want to thank you. I think a lot of people have shown a lot of appreciation for doing these daily briefings because in such an uncertain time, you want to hear from your leaders, and that you've been doing it daily has been really a welcomed thing, I think, for our community. So thank you for that. Next question comes from Twitter and from a person named Anne. When will things like libraries and public schools open?
So libraries and public pools, I think, is the...
public pools. I apologize. Yeah. Public pools.
It's so this is a very good question. It's what we're working on right now. So I think the important thing is I'll just tell you where we're at, which isn't necessarily a definitive answer, but here's where we're at. There was initial guidance given that in phase 1 or phase 2 of these state phases, that in early June, we might be able to open up these facilities in a limited capacity. So the idea is that whether it is checking and screening going into buildings or whether it is limiting the capacity and that kind of thing, that we want to be able to open up these facilities. So by next week, the city will be ready to know how to do all that. So that's, I think, on our end. That's what we control. So like right now, we're not even ready to do that. We don't even have the staff and we don't have the procedures and the protocols. But sometime next week, I think we will. So then we'll be ready to do that when the state gives us the go-ahead. So that second part of the question is, when is the state going to allow us to do that? Right now, again, the guidance was early June. We hope that's the case. But probably 10 days or so before. So in a couple of weeks, we'll get guidance on whether or not we'll actually be able to do that. So right now we're getting ready so that we can in early June, and we'll see if the state lets us.
Great. We have another live question from Jaime. If the numbers of positive cases increase during the reopening phase, will we go back into lockdown with stricter guidelines?
This is a great question, Jaime. And the plan is to reopen and stay open. And be ready for what we know are going to be these relapses, right, or these additional hotspots that occur. So one of the reasons why we're taking so long to plan to reopen is so that we have protocols in place for when there is a spike. So say, for example, at a particular grocery store, or maybe it's at a shopping mall, or maybe it's at an office building. We get some positives that are identified. We know a couple of things. Number one is we know who they've been in contact with, and that's why this notion of making everything by reservation only is important, because then I can say, okay, Alicia and I, we were both in the same building at the same time, so we both need to go get tested. So that's one, is to sort of know who you have to test. Two is to have the testing available. And I think we're actually getting a good place where we have that. So we would go get tested, and others who are sort of in that category. And then three is this notion of contact tracing. And that's the idea of saying, okay, well, we also both that day saw our family, and then we went to some other store, so all of them have to go get tested. That methodology takes a few days. We've been using it at our courthouses. And basically what it means is that we had to close the courthouse down for a day or two to re-sanitize, to do the contact tracing, and then to reopen with everyone who's been tested in quarantine. And so that process that I mapped out, that's actually going to be like a regular thing all summer. We should expect it. And as long as we have the testing capability in the process, it means we don't have to close down the whole city, right? We're just containing that area that we need to close down. So the answer is, if you're in contact with someone who's positive, yes, they'll be much more restricted. You'll have essentially quarantine rules that you have to follow. But for the rest of the city, we can stay open. That's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. You mentioned some of the new guidelines we will have to follow as we continue to move forward. So this question comes from Harvey, and it's around those guidelines. Where can people obtain face coverings now that they're more necessary? Is there any help for people in need of those?
So when it comes to face coverings, there's really a lot of different avenues, and I think it's important to understand that there is any face covering is better than no face covering. So you can use a scarf or a bandana. So at a minimum, like if you really feel like you need something, go ahead and use what you might already have. You can actually just cut up an old t-shirt. And so there's some guidance on this, but you want to have it kind of 2-ply, so at least 2 layers. And then, at a minimum, and it started out before I didn't have any, I'm just wrapping it, I'm tying a knot around, a scarf. So at a minimum, just know you can always do that. Now, we want to be able to offer things that actually are a little bit more helpful in terms of catching those water particles. And so there's lots of guidance all over the internet on how to do this. But you want to use a fine-grained cloth and then have it 2-ply. And then if you know someone who can make you one, that's a great way to do it. Or there's lots of places now you can order, again, these non-medical grade ones. And at the city, in a limited fashion, we are going to start providing ways in which people can get them. And it might be like when you get on the bus, or it might be when you go to a city facility, we'll have some available for the public on request. So that's really what we're working on doing right now. And of course, part of this is because we want to save all of the medical grade masks and that kind of thing for healthcare workers. So that is on reserve for that and for frontline essential folks. And that's what we do with our emergency system. And we have been doing that for the last few months. And so we're going to keep doing that. So know that we continue to supply all our hospitals and all our frontline and essential workers with PPEs. And that's something that the whole state's doing, and we are as well. But for private individuals, you can start, again, with that homemade option, or many places are going to start offering them. You're going to start seeing that even at grocery stores. So I think there'll be lots of avenues where you can get one.
So I know this is a ways off, but this has been a question that we've been hearing periodically. It's around the Balloon Fiesta and what the city's plan is for Balloon Fiesta this year. And this is a live question from Jason.
Thanks, Jason. Good question about the Balloon Fiesta. I think there is maybe some good and bad news. I think the bad news first is we don't know. It's possible that Balloon Fiesta is seriously jeopardized. It's the largest gathering in our state, and we know from Mardi Gras in New Orleans that giant mass gatherings can be a very dangerous idea. The good news is it's still far away, so we've got lots of time to make that decision. And so we're going to begin reaching out to them probably in getting serious about this in July. So in July, we'll probably have an initial indication like, you know what, it's not going to happen. Or it might be able to happen, and we'll talk to you again at the end of August. And the other reason for that is a modified Balloon Fiesta. So one where maybe it's more viewing from your car, for example, as opposed to being out on the field. So there are some different options that we can look at. And we'll really dive into those in July. And that gives us enough lead time to do what we need to do. Also, I want to remind folks, the Balloon Fiesta actually is it's like a contest for balloonists. So, again, there are options where we can enjoy in the city seeing the balloons, but maybe the actual field is closed. So again, there's lots of options we can go down, and we'll start working through that in July.
Thank you. So we'll go to another live question from Mary. Will youth sports be able to begin this summer again?
So Mary, great question. And this one is similar in a sense that we are now developing the protocols on how that could take place. So meaning that, you might be able to have, for example, games, but you can't have games at the same time. So instead of, tournaments are probably not going to happen at all. So the question is, can we have games so that it's just, 2 teams instead of 10 teams? And then it does depend on the sport. So, we're really looking at an axis, we think of a graph, you've got the number of people involved, and then how much those people, how proximate they are to each other. So, for example, indoor basketball or indoor water polo, these are probably not going to happen this summer because, again, you're in close proximity to each other. Now, interestingly, and again, I love all sports, so it's not a judgment on sports, but, things like softball and baseball are much more socially distanced, right? And this is the argument for golf. And they're also outdoors. So here's what we're doing. 1, we're developing the protocols on how we can do this. 2, we're looking to guidance from the national organizations. So there are the National Little League Association, National Softball Association, all of these things. And they're giving guidance for the country. So we're expecting that guidance at the end of May. So we'll have our policies in place. We'll get guidance nationally. I don't know which way they'll go. And then we'll be able to say, okay, here's what we might be able to do. But in general, I don't think anything in that category would happen until end of June, July. So your best case scenario is beginning in July. And your worst case scenario, of course, would be it's just for the whole summer, none of this will happen. And the middle of the road would be a modified situation. And so that's where we're at on that.
As you can imagine, a lot of the live questions we're getting in are around youth and their kids and schools and sports and all of that sort of thing. So this one comes from Tanya in a live question. Will you have any part in making the decision regarding APS going back to school in August?
So the question is about, our school system. And of course, I have kids in APS in that system. And I have one in and one hopefully to be in August. So we're very much attuned to the anxiety and the concerns around this. And the answer to your question is, I think APS is always very good about taking the city's input and my input. So, we'll be in the discussion. But it's APS's decision. It's also the state's decision. So when we saw schools close, remember the state actually closed the schools and APS, of course, agreed and that kind of thing. So I also just want to be honest with you. I'm sure I'll be there advocating and providing input, but that decision is really up to the state and up to APS.
Thank you for that. So this question, another live question, comes from Mark. And what is your plan to reduce crime during and after the pandemic?
Mark, thanks for your question about crime. And what we're doing right now, first during the pandemic, part of your question. One is we had to make sure that we have enough officers out continuing to fight crime and take calls. And that meant keeping the officers safe. So meaning that they don't come down with corona. So believe it or not, other cities like Detroit comes to mind. There's been others, I think Boston, where hundreds of police officers had to be pulled out of service because they tested positive. So we implemented some of the best health policies in our police department that we could gather from around the country. And it has to do with staffing so that if there is a positive case, there's only that particular squad, 4 or 5 people that then have to go get tested and be pulled off the field instead of 40 because they were rotating. So that is... that's a small thing, but that has been one of the biggest things we've done to protect public safety because so far we've allowed, by and large, all our officers out on the street. And so they've been through testing, and we expect positive cases and so forth, but our department hasn't been materially affected. So we've been able to keep up policing. The second thing that we did is we really want people to remember to call 242 COPS or 311 if it's not an emergency. And if it's a corona-related call, do not call 911. And people have been great about that. So Braqueños have actually helped us reduce response times because fewer people are calling 911. That's a good thing. We need to keep that up so that our officers can respond when it's important. Now, to your question about the future, there's a couple of things that we've been doing. Number one, we got 40 new officers out on the street. This is a great thing. They hit the street about the same time Corona hit, and they're in training till the end of the summer, but they're on the street, and our department has, just as a reminder, we came in 400 officers short from where we were 20 years ago. So we're trying to catch back up to 20 years ago, and then we probably need to do more after that. But we're still on target. That's a great thing. So our academy's running, and we're recruiting. Those folks are coming out. The last thing is with respect to violence intervention. In April, which was just last week, we were able to roll out our violence intervention program. So this is really aimed at our violent crime problem. And there's a host of things that have to do with interrupting the cycle of violence and retribution for violent actions in our community. And so this is a program that 23 or so other cities have used, and it's shown meaningful results. So we're just starting, but hopefully in 9 months or so, we're going to see the fruits of that. So we were able to implement that despite Corona.
Great. This is a very quick question, a live question from Daniel. Have you talked to other mayors?
Thanks, Daniel. I talk to other mayors all the time. In fact, there's a mayor's call right now. There are 2 mayor's calls right now that I'm missing to chat with you guys. So there's the U.S. Conference of Mayors. That's a national group of mayors. And on the call I just left, there are 400 some mayors on there, including the mayor of Santa Fe and the mayor of Las Cruces. They're part of that network with me as well. And we cover all of these topics. It's incredibly helpful. And then there's also a New Mexico Mayor's Caucus. And that call is later today. We talk every week. And then there's also a Central New Mexico Mayor's Call, which is on Friday every week. So actually a lot of the mayors and I are in very close contact all across the board, whether it's Bernalillo or it's Mountain Air or it's Santa Fe or it's Chicago or it's LA, Phoenix. Those are all mayors I've had personal conversations with in the last 3 days.
Thank you for that. So another live question from John, and this is about gathering, and I think we might see this moving forward a little bit, like with Mother's Day coming up and some of these special holidays. He says that there were about 75 people at a party at Snow Heights Park, no social distancing, no masks, that they called 242 COPS and said that they can get an email for the state police. His question is this closure a city closure of a park? Who is supposed to respond? I think it's more around enforcement.
Okay. And which park was it?
Snow Heights.
Interesting. Well, here's where we're at with parks. As a reminder that in the city of Albuquerque, we really fought to keep our parks open. But that's with an important caveat that there are no social gatherings. So you're supposed to use the park. You can have a picnic with your family. You can get your exercise in. And again, in either a family unit or a group less than 5. That's all totally acceptable. So even if it's kicking the soccer ball back and forth, that's okay. But we want you to do that and then go home. So the idea is, again, we don't have, mass gatherings at parks. So if you did see a mass gathering, that is something we do. We will send folks to remind folks and just disperse people. And so that is still not appropriate at this time. But in terms of enforcement, the answer is if it's something that is a very high level, like for example, I was in high school once, and if there's like a late night party at a park, that's something APD will take care of right away. And so that's dangerous for a number of reasons and illegal anyway. So that's something that we would do right away. Otherwise, the state is in charge of enforcement. And you can email the state at COVID-19@state.nm.us. That's the best way. They're, for whatever reason, taking complaints over email. So send that in, and that's how that gets routed.
Great. I think we're going to get ready to wrap up here, but I'll take another live question from Lillian. Lillian would like to know if she's required to go back to work if she's considered high risk.
Lillian, great question, and I'm glad we got that one in. The answer is, of course, as it is sort of in our country, a lot depends on your employer. Now, we believe that no one should be required to go back to work if they're at risk, and they should try and work from home if that's possible for your job. So that will be the city's stance, and that's what we can implement with respect to our 6,000 employees. Now, with respect to private companies, it might be different for each company, and I do know that the state is going to provide some guidance on this. So when we move from preparation to phase one, that is a situation where I would expect guidance from the state. So they're already saying, like, you have to do different things with respect to like face masks and social distancing and screening and things like this. The state's already saying all businesses have to do that. And so we are expecting that there'll be some regulations announced on this. But again, they won't be announced until we're actually starting to open. And again, right now, that's not really slated till June. So stay tuned on that. And I believe if you work at any government entity, you wouldn't be required to go back to work. But again, stay tuned if you work at a different place and how your employer will handle that under the guidance given by the state.
Thank you, Mayor. Now, we've answered as many questions as we possibly could with the allotted time. And unfortunately, I apologize for some of those live questions we weren't able to get to, but we really appreciate you tuning in and sending your questions in as well. And so thank you, Mayor, for your time as well.
Thanks so much. Well, I appreciate everyone who tuned in and sent in questions. We're going to continue to host these kind of Q&As, and we'd like to do one at least every few weeks, but we might be able to kind of squeeze this in weekly. We'll just see, again, how much there is that we have to get out to the public each day. And we'll see you tomorrow back on schedule, 11:30. We're going to talk a little bit about our Cultural Service Department and their relief programs for the creative economy and whatever we need to sort of discuss going into the weekend. Thanks so much, and stay healthy.